The question hanging over the Philippines' policy in the West Philippine Sea is no longer simply what President Ferdinand Marcos Jr. will do while he remains in office. Increasingly, the bigger question is what happens after him. That issue has become more important as Manila takes a firmer position on its maritime rights, strengthens security partnerships with other countries, and continues to rely on the landmark 2016 South China Sea arbitration ruling as the legal foundation of its position. President Marcos has now publicly acknowledged his own concern that a future Philippine administration could change course. During a July 5th, 2026 media interview in Vancouver, Canada, Marcos was asked whether he worried that his successor might take a different approach to the West Philippine Sea and weaken the gains his government believes it has made. President Marcos said, "So we really have to be consistent in that." That short statement goes directly to one of the biggest uncertainties surrounding Philippine foreign policy. Presidents change, political alliances change. Public priorities change, but geography does not. The Philippines will still face the South China Sea. Filipino fishermen will still depend on those waters. Philippine military and Coast Guard personnel will still operate around contested areas. And China will remain the Philippines' much larger neighbor, regardless of who occupies Malacañang. Marcos appears increasingly determined to make the present Philippine position difficult for a future administration to simply abandon. That position is built around several connected ideas: defending Philippine sovereign rights, relying on international law, keeping the 2016 arbitral ruling at the center of Manila's legal argument, avoiding unnecessary military escalation, and expanding partnerships with countries willing to support the Philippines' interpretation of maritime law. This is important because the Marcos administration's approach has represented a significant strategic development in Philippine foreign policy. Under Marcos, Manila has strengthened defense relations not only with its longtime treaty ally, the United States, but also with partners including Japan, Australia, and Canada. The armed forces of the Philippines has simultaneously been moving toward a greater emphasis on external defense and territorial security. That transition was highlighted again when Antonio Navarrete took over as AFP chief in July 2026 after the retirement of Romeo Brawner Jr. None of this means the Philippines has abandoned diplomacy with China. In fact, that is where the Marcos strategy becomes more complicated. Manila has been strengthening its defenses while continuing to talk to Beijing. It is challenging Chinese activities in disputed waters while maintaining commercial and diplomatic relations. It is deepening cooperation with countries suspicious of China's regional ambitions while repeatedly saying it does not want war. That combination is deliberate. In May 2026, Marcos again made clear that the Philippines continues to follow its one China policy. He said Manila does not want to interfere in issues concerning Taiwan, although he acknowledged that a conflict there would inevitably affect the Philippines because of geography and the large Filipino community living on the island. President Marcos said, "We do not want to be involved in any conflict." That statement helps explain the balancing act. The Philippine government wants stronger deterrence without turning deterrence into confrontation. It wants cooperation with allies without formally defining its entire foreign policy as an anti-China campaign. And it wants to defend its maritime position without closing the door to negotiations with Beijing. Those goals are not always easy to reconcile. The tension was particularly visible in July. On July 10th, Marcos marked the 10th anniversary of the 2016 South China Sea Arbitral Award by reaffirming his government's commitment to international law and the rules-based international order. The ruling remains fundamental to the Philippine position because the tribunal rejected the legal basis for China's sweeping historic rights claims within the so-called 9-dash line, although Beijing continues to reject the award. President Marcos said adherence to international law has proven to be non-negotiable, irreplaceable, non-optional. For Manila, the arbitration ruling is therefore more than a historical document. The Marcos administration is attempting to turn it into an enduring principle of Philippine policy. That matters when considering why political continuity has become such a sensitive question. A legal victory can remain on paper indefinitely, but its political significance depends heavily on whether successive governments continue invoking it, building diplomatic diplomatic support around it and incorporating it into national maritime strategy. If a future Philippine president were to dramatically reduce emphasis on the award, avoid confronting Chinese actions, or significantly weaken cooperation with Manila's security partners, Beijing would face a very different strategic environment. That possibility is one reason the political future of the Philippines matters far beyond domestic elections. It would be inaccurate, however, to claim without evidence that the Chinese government has openly admitted it is frightened by Marcos's policies. Beijing has not publicly framed its position in those terms. What can be documented is China's strong opposition to several elements of Manila's present security and maritime posture. China has repeatedly rejected the 2016 arbitration decision and has objected to the Philippines' increasingly close military cooperation with the United States and other partners. Beijing has also criticized Philippine officials who challenged Chinese claims. Those tensions became particularly personal in 2026 when China imposed restrictions on Philippine Defense Secretary Gilberte Teodoro Jr. and members of his immediate family. Teodoro has been among the most outspoken members of the Marcos administration in criticizing China's actions in the South China Sea. The episode illustrated how far relations have deteriorated in some areas, even while diplomatic communication continues. At sea, meanwhile, the disagreements have remained more dangerous. In June, the Philippine government reported that a Chinese structure had appeared inside the lagoon at Bahajo de Masinloc, internationally known as Scarborough Shoal. Malacanang said Marcos was aware of the development and that Manila would continue using diplomatic and legal measures to defend Philippine rights. Bajo de Masinloc remains one of the most politically sensitive locations in the dispute because Filipino fishermen have traditionally operated there and because control of access around the shoal has long been a major point of friction between Manila and Beijing. Then came another serious incident near Ayungin Shoal, also known internationally as Second Thomas Shoal. According to Philippine authorities, Chinese Coast Guard personnel confronted Philippine authorities. Philippine officials condemned the encounter while Beijing disputed Manila's description of Chinese responsibility. The confrontation was serious enough for Marcos to summon Chinese Ambassador Jing Quan. Yet what happened after that meeting revealed something significant about the president's approach. Rather than announcing the suspension of dialogue, Marcos sought what Philippine officials described as a reset in relations. After an approximately 80-minute meeting with the Chinese ambassador, Malacanang said the president wanted incidents of that kind to stop and hoped relations between the two countries could move toward better engagement. That is not the behavior of an administration looking for war. It is the behavior of a government trying to increase the costs of coercion while maintaining diplomatic exits. This distinction is critical. A stronger Philippine maritime position does not automatically mean an aggressive military policy. Manila's official position continues to emphasize diplomacy, restraint, and international law. Philippine Coast Guard Rear Admiral J. Tarrilla said in July that diplomacy remained the government's primary mechanism for settling differences with countries including China. He also praised Philippine personnel for exercising restraint during dangerous encounters rather than responding in ways that could escalate tensions. That restraint serves a strategic purpose. A violent clash in the West Philippine Sea could have consequences far beyond the ships directly involved. The Philippines is a treaty ally of the United States, which means any serious armed confrontation involving Philippine forces could immediately raise questions about Washington's commitments. It is precisely because the stakes are so high that small incidents matter. A collision, a boarding attempt, physical violence against personnel, a water cannon attack, or a miscalculation between military vessels can become more than a maritime dispute if political leaders lose control of events. Marcos has therefore tried to operate in the narrow space between two risks. The first risk is appearing so passive that China concludes pressure will succeed. The second is responding so aggressively that an incident turns into a wider military confrontation. For Manila, maintaining that balance requires more than statements from one president. It requires institutions capable of carrying the same broad strategy into the future that explains the significance of Marcos's warning about his successor. He is effectively acknowledging that the durability of Philippine policy cannot depend entirely on Ferdinand Marcos Jr. A future president could reassess military agreements. A new administration could emphasize economic relations with China. It could reduce public exposure of maritime incidents. It could place less importance on security cooperation with Western and regional partners. Or it could maintain the basic Marcos framework while changing its tone. Philippine history demonstrates that foreign policy can change noticeably between administrations. Rodrigo Duterte pursued a more conciliatory relationship with Beijing during much of his presidency and frequently emphasized the economic advantages of improved China ties. Under Marcos, the Philippines moved towards stronger public assertion of its maritime claims and deeper security cooperation with Washington and other partners. That contrast is part of the reason succession matters so much. From Beijing's perspective, Philippine politics therefore has strategic consequences, even if Chinese officials never openly describe themselves as fearful of the outcome. China has reasons to watch whether the current approach becomes institutionalized or remains closely identified with a single administration. If the Marcos policy survives beyond 2028, Beijing could find itself facing a long-term Philippine strategy rather than a temporary presidential preference. That would be a much more consequential development. A durable policy could mean that future Philippine governments continue strengthening the Coast Guard and Navy, building maritime awareness, conducting exercises with partners, publicizing encounters at sea, and invoking international law whenever Chinese and Philippine claims collide. It could also mean expanding what Manila has already been doing diplomatically, persuading more governments to publicly support the principles behind the arbitral decision, even when those governments do not take positions on sovereignty over individual land features. Canada has been one such partner. Marcos specifically pointed to international support during his July remarks as validation of Manila's position. Australia has also been deepening defense cooperation with the Philippines. On August 7th, Australian and Philippine defense leaders met in Darwin, where both sides again emphasized support for international law and stronger security cooperation. Australia also plans to participate in future major military exercises with the Philippines. These relationships matter because the dispute is increasingly about more than individual reefs and shoals. It is also about the regional balance of power. China, under President Xi Jinping, possesses overwhelming military and economic advantages compared with the Philippines acting alone. Manila cannot realistically match Beijing ship for ship or aircraft for aircraft. Its strategy, therefore, depends heavily on raising the diplomatic, legal, and strategic costs of coercion. International partnerships are part of that equation. Modernizing Philippine forces is another. Publicizing encounters is another. And maintaining the legitimacy of the 2016 ruling is perhaps the most important legal component. During his July 27th State of the Nation address, Marcos again emphasized the arbitration ruling and the Philippines' determination to stand by its maritime rights, reinforcing the impression that the West Philippine Sea has become one of the defining foreign policy issues of his presidency. But even a firm policy has limits. Marcos continues to seek economic engagement and diplomatic communication with China. Earlier in 2026, Manila and Beijing resumed high-level talks dealing with the South China Sea, as well as energy security and other areas of cooperation. The two sides discussed maritime tensions while also exploring possible cooperation in areas including energy, agriculture, and trade. This illustrates something easily lost in the dramatic headlines surrounding the dispute. The Philippines and China are not simply adversaries. They are neighbors with significant economic ties, diplomatic relations, and overlapping regional interests. Neither side can make the other disappear. The real challenge is establishing rules for managing disagreements without allowing those disagreements to become armed conflict. For the Philippines, that means refusing to surrender legal positions simply for the sake of calmer relations. Simply for the sake of calmer relations. For China, it means deciding whether its objectives can be pursued without creating an increasingly organized network of countries concerned about Chinese maritime pressure. The more pressure Manila experiences, the greater the incentive for the Philippines to deepen relationships with outside partners that can create a cycle Beijing itself may not want. Chinese pressure encourages Philippine security cooperation with other countries. Stronger Philippine security partnerships then trigger more criticism from China. That criticism reinforces fears in Manila, encouraging further inquiry. Breaking that cycle requires diplomacy, but diplomacy works best when both sides believe the other has reasons to compromise. That is why Marcos's approach contains both firmness and engagement. He is not arguing that the Philippines can defeat China in a contest of raw power. The message is instead that Manila intends to make its maritime rights politically and legally difficult to erase. The durability of that message will ultimately be tested not during Marcos's presidency, but after it. If the next Philippine administration preserves the core elements of the current strategy, then Marcos will have succeeded in transforming his West Philippine Sea policy from an administration policy into something closer to a national doctrine. If the next president reverses it, dramatically, Beijing could discover that patience produced what pressure could not, a Philippine government willing to reduce confrontation and rethink the country's strategic alignment. That is the political uncertainty Marcos is now talking about, and it is why the 2028 succession is already relevant to the South China Sea dispute. For Filipino citizens, however, the debate is larger than personalities or political camps. It involves access to fishing grounds, maritime resources, territorial security, freedom of navigation, and the principle that disputes between powerful and smaller states should be governed by law rather than coercion. Marcos has repeatedly tried to frame the issue in those terms. His administration argues that defending Philippine maritime rights does not require rejecting diplomacy, nor does speaking with China require abandoning the arbitration ruling. The government is trying to do both at the same time, keep negotiations open while refusing to concede what it regards as legally established Philippine rights. Whether that approach survives the next presidential transition may become one of the most important strategic questions facing the country. China will certainly be watching, so will the United States, Japan, Australia, and other regional partners. But most importantly, Filipinos will be watching because the decision made by the next administration will help determine whether the current West Philippine Sea strategy represents only one chapter of the Marcos presidency or the beginning of a much longer Philippine policy. For now, Marcos is making his position increasingly clear. He wants continuity. He wants future governments to continue using international law. He wants the arbitral ruling to remain central. He wants Philippine maritime rights defended without unnecessarily triggering war. And despite the increasingly difficult relationship with Beijing, he continues to leave room for diplomacy. That combination explains why the policy can frustrate China while also avoiding a complete diplomatic rupture. The next question is whether the strategy outlives the president who strengthened it. Because in the West Philippine Sea, political leadership will change, administrations will come and go, and regional circumstances will evolve. But the dispute itself is unlikely to disappear. The real test for the Philippines is therefore no longer simply whether it can stand firm today. It is whether it can remain consistent tomorrow.